One of the main things you want to remember is to fish with big baits, fish them slow, fish them in the heat of the day. I caught my personal best at high noon. I've decided to only fish for big fish, big bass, and to keep me from going back and start fishing for small fish, I just pack my tackle box very light. What you see in this tackle box is what I take. I take big lures that have big hooks. Some top water, some shallow runners. I don't have any deep running bait in here. I can't tell you how many big fish I've caught off on this spinner ditty. This thing's been around since I was a kid. This one here doesn't have big enough hooks on it. I'm not satisfied with those hooks. A big bass can sling those hooks out of his mouth. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take and replace all these hooks with bigger hooks like this one here. It's got the real big hooks on it. I caught my personal best on this one. This is a 5.5 inch Rebel minnow. It's silver and black. It just waddles through the water. I mean, sometimes when I'm reeling in the back of the boat, it makes me think it's a fish swimming by. And it swims about, 2 to 3 feet. It floats until you start reeling it. You can treat it like a top water. But the main thing I wanted to show you is look at the size of those hooks. When a fish hits that, he's hooked. And the more they jump and start slinging the plug, in most cases they're going to hook themselves even better. Instead of getting 1 or 2 hooks in them, fish I catch on this lure, they're always hooked with at least 2 and sometimes all 3 treble hooks. So that's by far my favorite. I fished with this lure from the 60s when I was growing up in one different size or another. And I can't tell you how many big bass and I have caught off of that Rebel. And you can buy that from their website for $6.99. This is also a same type product. It's a broken back. It's not as big. I'm going to try to check and see if they've got a bigger one. But this one here, I'm not satisfied with the size hooks on it. They're a little bigger than some of the others, but I still like the bigger hooks. This one gives you more action when it goes through the water because of the broken back. And you'll see here some shallow running crankbait that mimic a crawdad. Now these have got big hooks on them. Just a pair of them. And then there's different colors of them. This is a lure that needs to have the hooks changed on it. I'm not real pleased with the fact that it just got 2 sets of trebles on it. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to change them out, make them bigger. This is a spin-off of what I used to fish with back in the day when my dad and I would go fishing. It was called a nipper ditty. A spinner ditty. And my dad taught me how to fish topwater bait. At the time, he was a smoker. And he'd say that you need to be able to smoke an entire cigarette on one cast of a topwater. Throw it out there and let it sit, and you should be able to smoke a whole cigarette by the time that cast is over. This lure here is designed to catch big fish. Actually, it's more of a saltwater lure, but a bass don't know the difference. They'll hit it. It's just got 2 sets of big hook on it. This is the kind of lure that just goes across the top. You can walk the dog with it. But I've had more luck with the ones that kind of go under a couple 3 feet. Now this one here, it's got the big hooks, the lippers crankbait. I took this thing to Florida and fished with it in the Gulf, and you can see it's kind of beat up, but this is an ounce, a 1 ounce lure. If you're going to fish big bass, you don't need to have any lure any less than 5 inches long, or at least an ounce. And again, the big hooks. You really need those big hooks if you're going to catch big bass. Frog, I'm not a super fan of a frog. You got 2 decent sized hooks in there. It's not a very big bait. I may try it from time to time, but this definitely wouldn't be one that I would start out with. And this is a very shallow running crankbait. It's got the big hooks, big and bulky. This one here just runs about a foot, 1.5 feet deep. But it's definitely a shallow water bait. But again, when you're fishing for the big bass, you're going to have to fish it real slow. They're not going to be out on the prowl looking for baits. They're looking for an easy meal. They're lazy. They're not going to chase a crankbait running through the water. They're not going to chase a spinner bait that you cranking back to the boat 90 miles an hour. But I probably wouldn't even fish for big fish with just a 1 hook crankbait. I mean, if you're going to do it, at least put a trailer hook on there and put something on it and make it look a little bigger. Buy the biggest crankbait you can find. And where I fish, it's always in clear water, so I usually stick with light colored lures. If I was going to use a jig across the bottom, it would be the big ones. It would be the kind that you drag and stir up a little mud or sand when you're dragging it across, but I'm not a big fan of that. Fishing with worms. This is I think this is a 10-inch, but it's not big enough to suit me. You can buy some on line that are 12 inches. And when you're fishing with a worm, this one here I rigged up with a 2nd hook in the back of it. But if you're going to fish with just 1 hook up front, you need to make it a pretty big hook that goes as far down the worm's body as you can get it. And when you're fishing with a worm for big bass, you're probably not going to need a weight on there. If it's a big 12-inch worm, the weight of the worm itself will be all you need. Now, the way we fished worms in the old day, which I like, I still do it today. I don't set the hook as soon as the fish strikes the worm. I release my spool or bail, whatever I'm fishing with, and I let him run. And I just kind of sense when to set the hook. Never have had a big issue of losing fish when I'm fishing with a worm, because I let them go ahead and swallow it. I'm not a big fan of just hooking them in the mouth and hope you get a big fish in. That'd be great for a small fish, but the big fish, why take a chance? Why not go ahead and put big hooks, fish with big bait? Some of the plastic swim baits, if some of them just got 1 big treble hook in them, I'm not a big fan of that. I've lost some fish on those, and I'm probably not ever going to use those again. I'm going to stick with these type product. This company's doing inventory right now. I tried to order some more of these, but they're not even going to ship out again for a couple of weeks. But you can't go wrong with this one, especially if you're looking for big fish, big bass. Some things that you want to consider when you're fishing for big bass, you want to make sure that where you're fishing, the lake has got plenty of forage in it, plenty of things for them to eat and grow on. It's a good thing about fishing down south where I live, there's just a lot longer growing season, and the bass have an opportunity to grow quite a bit more. You'll find some of your bigger bass toward the end of the season. But I've caught some mighty big ones in the summer. And I'll close with this little tidbit from back in the day when I was fishing with a buddy. The county I grew up in was surrounded by rivers. We had the Black Warrior River on one side, the Tombigbee River on the other. And his grandmother had a piece of land that you could get to what was called the Dead Rivers, where the Tombigbee River had changed course, and it was about a mile in there that it had been blocked off. You couldn't get in there by a boat from the main river. Only way in was to drive in on dry days. If it was wet, you couldn't get back in there. And then you had about a quarter mile you had to carry a boat. So you'd use a little john boat, and you'd take it through the woods, and you'd find a place to let it down into the river. And you'd take a couple paddles, and you'd take a your spinning reel or bait caster, whatever, and you'd start fishing. And you'd start catching humongous bass. I don't think I ever caught a bass out of there less than 5 pounds. And we would use worms. Like I said, when they'd strike it, we'd release the bail and let them run with it. Hardly ever had an issue with losing them. They would get tangled up sometimes, so sometimes you couldn't let them run like you wanted to. But I think down there is where the biggest bass that ever struck one of my lures. It happened right down there. I was using a big full-size Lucky 13 that my dad had. It was a bait caster, and back in the 60s, those things were lunkers of lures. They were big. They were just humongous, probably about 5.5, 6 inches long. And I threw that thing out and let it sit there and just twist it a couple of times. The next thing I saw was just a swirl around my lure, and it was gone. And that fish took off, and I fought him for a while, but he finally got me twisted all up in some logs and stumps, and he broke me off. I really never saw how big he was, but about 20 minutes later, he had slung that hook, and my Lucky 13 came floating back to the top, and I went over there and got it. Never know how big that fish was, but I'll tell you, it was the big lure, had big hooks on it, and if it had been a place where you could have actually played him, I didn't have heavy enough line. Back in those days, it wasn't in my budget to change lines every time you wanted. I just put on, I think I was fishing with 10 pounds, but today, I'm fishing 20 pounds with a bait caster. Fish it right out of my kayak. Keep my kayak parallel to the bank, maybe about 10 feet off the bank, and cast straight in front of my kayak just as far as I can. Farther away from the boat, the better. Because I'll tell you, noise, trolling motors, they will definitely spook your big bass. And again, if you're going to catch a big bass, you need to be a loner. You need to fish alone. Fish in the middle of the day. All of the other anglers have gone home. They've gotten hot, gone home. Now you out there with just you and the big bass, and you can go out there and catch the ones that they missed. On this lure right here, the day I caught my personal best, there was two men came down the bank. They saw me and they kind of turned away. I was on down further. My plans were to go back up that same bank. They came right by where I caught that big personal best. But I was fishing by myself, making hardly any noise, no trolling motor, just disturb the mood of the fish. And he wasn't all up in a brush pile. You just gotta learn how they act. And first things first, they're slow, they're lazy, they didn't get big by striking at everything that came down the pike. So I thought I'd just share that with you. And always predetermine what fish bait what lures you're going to take with you. You're not going to need any more lures than what's in there. And the good thing about just taking lures for big fish, then that's all you're going to fish for. You may get a little fish, strike it. I've had this little, on this Rebel, I've seen little fish trailing it back to the boat, but they weren't big enough to hit it. So I just thought I'd share that with you. If you're going to catch big fish, then you're going to have to fish for them. And don't be tempted to quit fishing for the big fish and just go out and start catching fish. I mean, you've caught enough fish in your lifetime, probably don't do you much good, but when you catch that big one, you know you got something there. So just thought I'd share that with you.